Howdy, this is Mark from Stork Banjo. So I just finished building this banjo right here. And I thought I would just do a little bit of a video about the joint where the headstock attaches to the neck, because it was something that started out as like part of the inspiration for building this particular banjo. And so here you can see the finished results. So I'll just do a little bit about how I got to that point. All right, hope you enjoy it. See you at the other end. I really wanted to play around with the Martin bird's mouth neck joint, so this is my first crack at it. Just really rough, so it's kind of a cool joint. Look at that there. And so of course the nice thing here is you get good gluing surface, face grain. All right, and then but then you also get this is a volute on the back side. So this thing's too huge. It's got to be way smaller than this. But anyway, this is just my first shot at trying it. It's a very cool little joint. So I'm going to use this on my my next banjo here, my Chippendale English minstrel banjo, my Chippendale English minstrel banjo. So this banjo is actually nominally a recreation of a banjo attributed to R.A. Sanders. Clifton Hicks posted pictures of it, and it had a really ugly headstock, which I didn't like. And I've sort of stolen this shape nominally from Chippendale furniture. Well, not exactly stolen at all. It's really just inspired by some of the finials they would put on the headboards of high boys and stuff like that. So that's why I call it Chippendale. And let me go back to my first version of it here. So this is my first sort of real rough kick at the can. I'm trying to work out how to do this joint. There's almost there's no tutorials available for it except through O'Brien Guitars. It's a paywall there, and there's like one German guy that sort of demonstrates doing it, but he doesn't go into great detail. What's kind of nice is that it's all based on the thickness of your headstock here. Martin Guitars used it extensively in their earlier days. They still feature it, but they fake it now. If you look closely at a contemporary Martin guitar, this little detail they have on the back of the headstock, it's carved in. It's not part of the joinery. So I guess C.F. Martin originally, he trained in Vienna and learning to build Viennese guitars in the early 1800s, I guess. And so I'm assuming that this joint is pretty much traditional to that type of lutherie. I got a friend that builds guitars like that. I shouldn't really talk to him about it. Anyhow, so I kind of like the details. Now, the trick with doing this one is this particular relief here, because this comes up right to a point, it's really hard to get any tools in there. You'd have to go against the grain with a chisel in order to clear that out, unless you use routers and stuff like that, which I don't really want to use. I mean, you could, obviously, but then you need a jig to set up the router, and I'd like to try and figure out how to do this by hand if I can. So coming up to this absolute peak is really tricky. So it occurred to me, if this stopped short, if this wedge came through the surface, there's a point at which you could have like a 1/4 inch opening and be able to get in there with a hand tool going in the proper direction. So that's where this version came in. Now my joinery is shit here, so, but because this is all experimentation. But if you see that one, just by widening out that triangle, it leaves me an entry ramp, right? And here's a better idea of where I'm going for with the sort of the shape of that. So yesterday, after my failed steam bending attempts, I started to turn my attention back to this neck joint, and I played around with how to cut it on a table saw. And what's kind of cool is I figured out that I can do this, like most of this joinery, with one angle set up and one height set up, except for cutting the shoulders here requires a different height setup. But basically, that's a square cut, that's a square cut. You set this up in a like a tenoning jig on the table saw, and we get one square cut here at one height, and then you turn it 90 degrees. You set your angle for one square height. You set your angle for my 15-degree neck angle, and then I can cut that ramp, and I can cut that ramp with one height, turn it 90 degrees again, cut that ramp and then that ramp with one height. So I just gotta flip the neck around in the tenoning jig in order to do that. And that yields me what you see here, actually. And then the last trick is this part of the bird's mouth has got angles to it that don't jive with the rest of it. So that you need to do by hand, but that's the same angle as all the rest. I've gone with one angle throughout. And to cut those, just make up a little jig here with that angle. I clamp it onto the tongue and just use a chisel to pare down. It's kind of tricky though, the grain's like not going in your favor. So I thought that worked out pretty good, and I was playing around with what you need to do to try and make the joint accurate. And this is better, not perfect, but better. But the thing with this particular build is I've got this beautiful piece of oak I want to use for the neck. This is not it, but it's got some fantastic medullary rays running through it that I want to keep. And what I'm going to be doing with this one, just because it's interesting to me and it kind of fits the period, is I want to use bone frets. So I've got a pile of bone that I'm going to be laying in here. They're like less than 1/8 of an inch wide. They're about, I don't know, 3/32 or something like that. They're basically, they're guitar bridges. And so I'm going to put bone frets in throughout. You often saw like flat bone fret markers, but it'd be a flush fingerboard. But I'm gonna do raised frets because my fretless playing kind of sucks, to be honest. Even though I kind of like playing that way too. But anyhow, so because of that, I don't want to do a separate fingerboard. I want the fingerboard to be solid. I just want those frets let into it, and that means this joinery here is not intended to be exposed. It's intended to have an overlay on there. So now I got to figure out how to do this joinery with a headstock that now has to sit a little bit lower because I don't have the ability to drop an overlay on here that matches with this overlay so that you can have the nut buried and stuff like that. So then I figured out I need to do a haunch. So I did this whole setup again, this time, you know, doing a little relief there. Now this joinery isn't quite as nice on this one, but the haunch makes cutting that, couldn't use that jig anymore to do these angled cuts because of that haunch. There was no way of clamping that little guide block on there. So I accomplished that by, I'm sure you can see some guidelines. I just drew some guidelines on to eyeball and then just freehanded it with my chisel to try and get those angles. So that worked out okay, and that's got me going in kind of the right direction, or at least it's giving me some stuff to play around with, and it's kind of interesting to figure out how to fit this. I suppose what's kind of neat about it is if you do these cuts accurately, this part just has to follow down and stay flush with that back cut. And then you can play around with this ramp. Basically, if it's not fitting yet, you keep working that ramp down until it does, and then work down the shoulders and, you know, play around with trying to find your high spots. And I think I got real close on this, and I actually even played around with kerfing out this joint with some sandpaper. Just got it down to where it was almost touching. I didn't want to play around with this anymore, and I just used some sandpaper in here to, you know, pull it through, floss it out until I got a fit that was more appealing to me. Now this was already cut from this joint, so I was kind of boxed in terms of how accurate I could make this once I didn't have the wiggle room to make it super tight. But the kind of cool thing about this joint is if you blow it, if you're not tight, you overdid it, all you got to do is cut this back a little bit. Just knock a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch off, and then you go back in there and start recutting that ramp until it fits. So as long as you've given yourself plenty of extra length, you can infinitely be marching your way down, working your way towards a good fit. So that's kind of a cool thing about the joint.
So I'm giving this banjo a headstock overlay made out of bone, and I decided I could glue that on to the headstock itself before attaching the headstock to the banjo. And that worked out really well. It allowed me to play around with drilling holes into it and such without the rest of the neck being attached and getting in my way. It allowed me to use a drill press for that sort of thing. And I'm using hot hide glue to attach the headstock to the neck, and so I'm just warming it now with a heat gun before slopping the hide glue in. And the neat thing about hide glue is as it cures or as it dries, it has a tendency of pulling a joint closed. And so you don't really need to clamp this when you're done exactly. It will actually kind of draw it a little bit tighter than it is when you first slap it in there. That's something a luthier friend taught me, and it's quite effective. And of course, because the hide glue is water soluble, you can clean up very easily. You don't have to be super neat about it.
Okay, so I'm going to come back and do another video about the whole build. I don't have the whole thing documented in video format, but there's a pile of pictures and stuff like that and a few videos, so I'll come back and I'll talk about it in another video. I hope you enjoyed it. All right, folks, catch you later.
Now, I build banjos as a hobby, but I make my living building wooden boats, and you can check out my work over on my other channel, Nomad Boat Building.